At least I'll start. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for making time and coming. As you know, this is part of an ongoing series on sort of war and peace in the eastern part of Europe. I am substituting for Professor Sergei Radchenko, who couldn't be here today. So I will just be doing sort of brief introductions and then helping moderate what we hope is a sort of a lively conversation. So we are really pleased today to have with us Dr. Andrew Monaghan from the United Kingdom, and here he wears many hats, including being the founding director of the Russia Research Network. He's at the Royal United Services Institute, has an affiliation also with the with St. Anthony College, with the George F. Kennan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., as long as that's still around.
Well, yeah, and we'll find out.
We'll find out, won't we? Et cetera. He is going to be teaching on or talking on a very timely, unfortunately, topic, which is the Russian way of war. I know I had some folks ask me in the past few weeks about the strategic culture and how that plays a role in how people think about these issues. I'm sure this is going to talk about that and have a sort of a good case study on some of that. He has said that he's going to do some talking, but what he'd really like is some interaction. So why don't we let him kick it off, and then we can have a good discussion as we go on. For those who are tuning in on Zoom, as we get to the point, type some questions in, and I will be looking for those, and so I'll be fielding those and just trying to help keep the Q&A and discussion going. So, Andrew, thank you very much for taking the time to come here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you also to Johns Hopkins SAIS for the hospitality and the invitation to come to speak to you all. Good afternoon. It is a beautiful sunny day, and I very much appreciate your turning out here rather than going and enjoying the sunshine. It is, as Andrew just said, how can I put this? There's a lot to talk about. When we talk about Russia, we talk about war. There's addressing Russia and international themes. There's always a lot to say at the moment, including, of course, what is underway in Saudi Arabia and Istanbul, and the discussions that are underway, as well as the continuation of what is happening in Ukraine. So it affects most of our capitals across NATO. That being said, I'm going to focus my initial remarks, at least specifically on what I'm going to call the Russian way in war. And then we can go wider to discuss other themes. Of course, even this narrowing opens many questions about Russia particularly, but about war and strategy more generally. I speak to you as a Brit speaking to an international audience in Italy about Russia, also at a time when there is obviously a war underway. So it's a series of sensitive subjects. Are there any Russians in the room? No? Any Russian speakers in the room? Russian, yes, yes, you speak Russian? No, okay. No Russian speakers. Okay, I ask partly because, well, I'm going to speak about Russia, so it's always useful for me to know if there are actually any people from the country in the room. But second, because I'll just draw an explicit line to say so often the Euro-Atlantic community in Moscow find themselves living in different worlds. We draw different conclusions, sometimes from the same bodies of evidence and sometimes even from different bodies of evidence. So these days, it's very hard to find a conversation and draw together two sets of narratives. So I'm going to be a Brit trying to interpret Russian evidence. I will put forward to begin with, it's not about trying to be agreeing with or disagreeing with. I think when one is trying to interpret strategy, one is looking at empathy, and empathy is not sympathy. So I'll just start that from the beginning. I think if we don't at least begin to look through Russian sources, then we find ourselves dealing with an abstract. And if you're dealing with an abstract, then you can paint all sorts of things on it, which in fact we've done for most of the last 15 years, which is why we keep being surprised. So second, I'm from a background in war studies that is multidisciplinary, and that's how my approach is going to be today. So with a great deal less sensitivity on this particular part, I'm going to march across deliberately a number of different disciplines. IR and political science, Russia studies, history, culture, The intent is not to be insensitive to those disciplines. The intent is to see what we can wring out from each different discipline to understand and interpret the question more thoroughly, to interpret Russian activity, to interpret perhaps what we might want to do with it. So yes, as Andrew says, we will talk a bit about strategic culture and what that means. I will push some of the definition, I think, a little bit further than is customary. But if you're going to talk about a Russian way in war, you also have to talk about history. And there's quite a lot to say about that. It's an essential ingredient to the Russian way in war and Russian strategy making. It's absolutely essential. That being said, there are different approaches to history, which we will also have to work our way through. What do we mean by history? What use is history? So we'll take some of these questions in, and really the thrust of my remarks is to talk about continuity and change over time, what is universal in strategy making and what is distinctively Russian, and then of course also about Moscow's strategy and thinking about war. So I'll begin a little bit with strategic culture and way in war, Russian views. I will then turn a bit towards campaigning against Ukraine. Is this Putin's war or Russia's war? Is it a war? In fact, I think is quite important to say. And here, I'm quite sure that everyone in the room recognizes at a human level that it is obviously a war. But I want to also start to look at that and ask, what does war, vojna, which is the Russian word for war, what does that mean? And is there a substantive distinction between специальная военная операция and vojna? And then to conclude, I'll suggest where we might be looking if we're trying to interpret Russian activity today and tomorrow, so to speak. So I will speak for perhaps 20, 25 minutes, something like that. The shorter the better as far as I'm concerned, in order to have more questions with you. Let's start with strategic culture. Much debated, of course, but I think quite important here. Just to track it through so that we're all on the same page. The usual reference point here is Jack Snyder and Soviet nuclear decision making. Yes, Jack Snyder eased away from strategic culture, but really this was variations on themes of Soviet conduct and Soviet power. Okay, so of course we're also talking about George Kennan. We're talking about Kennan's British counterpart, often overlooked in Moscow, Frank Roberts. We're also talking about Soviet approaches to war, so Nathan Laty's. Of course, this idea naturally with strategic culture was tested subsequently. I won't go through all that. I imagine that you do that here, but let's call it the debate between Colin Gray and Ian Johnston. Some of the challenges about culture, what do we mean by strategic culture? Is there more than one culture within a state, and so on and so forth? All of this is very useful, in fact, for interpreting Russian strategic culture today. And if someone doesn't ask it, I'll ask Andrew to ask, is there more than one culture in Russia? And the answer is yes, and we can go into that. The question of Russian strategic culture specifically became much more of a theme of interest since the 2010s, and again since 2022. To my taste, I think most of the current discussion about Russian strategic culture falls short of the Gray-Johnston debate. In many ways, and the critiques of it. In many ways, the reasons are because people use strategic culture as a fig leaf for talking about what they want to talk about. So you get a little splash of history, a little dash of geography, and then we're off on to saying that Russia is an authoritarian country riven with corruption. Honestly, if in 2025 anyone needs to be told that Russia is an authoritarian country with heavy dose of corruption, we have a lot of work to do. But I think we can push this a little bit further, and I will talk a bit about these aspects explicitly and implicitly today. For me, if you're going to interpret Russia, you have to look at historical, geographical, and cultural aspects when you look to interpret Russian strategy. Let me give you an example. So, lessons of history. The Russian state leadership, and particularly the military leadership, especially draw on history as the experience of the past to inform the current interpretation and to provide sight to the future. So a very didactic use of history. the lesson learning history. And this is the first part where we find that our history, and I'll speak here as a Brit in Bologna, but frankly, we could go with US history or Italian history, looks very different to the Russian history. And the points of reference and the wars of reference and how those wars are interpreted in strategic activity and diplomacy are all interpreted very differently. For instance, the Crimean War. I'll just give this an example now. The Crimean War, we think of as a Brit, naturally I think of the glorious charge of the Light Brigade, a poorly conceived set of orders which led to an operational and tactical problem, even though, let's say, in the end the war was won. For the Russians, this is one example of a multi-front war waged by the West, the collective West, against Russia. And this is a recurring theme that, for instance, the Napoleonic invasion of 1812, the German invasion of 1941, these are not seen as Napoleonic or Hitlerian invasions. They are seen as the whole of Europe invading Russia. And the Crimean War is not just a war in the Black Sea. The Crimean War was a war in which the maritime powers used their forces to attack in the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, the High North, and the Far East. So it's in many ways, it's sometimes called World War Zero now in the Russian discussion. And yes, the Russian military draws on these debates and draws on this history and learns from it. There are lots of other examples, but just to float this idea and to illustrate, just to put the idea into your minds that we can come back to and discuss. Second, there are geographical dilemmas that impose on Russian strategy, not only the question of climate and socioeconomic geography, but distance from almost everywhere, the difficult neighborhoods. And the most important one, as far as I'm concerned at the moment for our interpretation of Russia today, the dilemma between, is Russia a continental state or a maritime state? Some of you who've been reading Your Little Heart will recognize where I'm going already. But I think the most important part of that, so again, I'm pushing, you can't just say that Russia is an eastern appendage of Europe and then involve it in European history a bit and talk a bit about Peter the Great and a bit about Catherine the Great and then head off into Putin and authoritarianism. You have to use the lessons of history in a dynamic and creative way, one that also lines into how the Russian leadership also uses it. Not accepting the arguments necessarily, but interpreting the method of how that history is used. The geography too is not just a question of Russia being a European power. This is fundamentally and clearly not only half truth, but even not the beginning of the truth. So as I say, we must take it much further, and we'll come back to distance and continental and maritime later. But there are also the human aspects of strategy, and this is what is often overlooked in strategic culture. And this is what we might turn into the to 3 or 4 Russian examples of culture. For instance, there are those of you who maybe have served in civil service or armed forces or even actually possibly in a university. Dare one say it, there is indecision in policy making. I just want to be, I thought that can you imagine indecision in decision making? Нерешительность. There is negligence. There is a sense of oh, well, something's been written down on paper, therefore we don't need to put it into practice. It's already done. There are all of these cultural aspects, which I lived in Rome working for NATO for some years, and I just want to make sure that we're all clear that's not something that we would find here or in NATO or in the UK, or for that matter in the United States. So just recalling that sense of what is universal and what is distinctive, we must factor this into our interpretation of Russian thinking as well. Lack of decision-making, lack of discipline, negligence. There is the Russian phrase bardak, for those of you who are not familiar with it, which is difficult to translate into British, because naturally this never happens in the UK, but it's a form of uncontrolled events. Just as the Russians don't have a word themselves for fiasco, of which, of course, we have plenty. There are other terms as well which we must bear in mind, like shvondershina, which I've tried to create myself as a means of reading Russian culture, reading Russian literature. Schwander is a very good example of a very mediocre, mid-ranking official who is ideologically driven and urged to, not afraid of using the Secret Service. These people also permeate. There are the lazy, there are the ideological, there are the competent. So you have to be looking at strategic culture and the chain of command in a dynamic way. Only on this, and I've just tried to touch this a little bit, only in this way, I think, is the discussion of strategic culture helpful. When you're using it as a means to open up and drive a set of discussions about how a state does and does not function. Okay, the moment you hear strategic culture as well, it's a bit of Peter the Great and it's Eastern Europe, and then you know that this is not really strategic culture. It is neither the difficulties of strategy nor the complexities of culture. So what we mean by this, in many ways, strategy is the Russian term is protivoborochny mir. Strategy is the active effort by the leadership to take control or retake control of uncontrolled events. Of course, I will argue, and it's not really a lecture about Russian strategy, but we're talking strategy here as assumptions about the future on which you build plans, which you then resource and organize and try to implement. What we're looking at really, though, is not that specific aspect of strategy. We're looking at the rounded three-dimensional version of this. So the strategic culture is a lens not only into why decision makers do something differently, but it's also the extent to how that state functions or not. And then you get to explore the chain of command, you get to explore the different concepts, you get to explore all of these other, I think, fascinating questions. So this is where I draw on Basil Littlehart's Way in War. And here I distinguish a little bit between that form of strategic culture, but also the historian's view of way of war, which is a historical view, which takes us up to the current part, which is fine, but it doesn't talk to strategy. What it does do, as I'll say, is it's a search for a strategic philosophy. Those of you who read it, those of you who are familiar with Littlehart, you will know that this comes from 1931, a lecture he gave at RUSI, coincidentally. I know this has been contentious ever since because the first person who asked the first question of Littlehart's presentation disagreed with him. Very good. This is the whole purpose of academia, of thinking and debate. So it's contentious, but I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful because it reflects persistent themes, traditions, priorities, problems, and how to deal with dilemmas, which is exactly what Moscow is trying to do. Really what Littlehart was trying to do was to draw and select lessons of the past for interpreting the present, but also looking into the future. A synthesis of history and strategic theory, therefore, to shape strategy in a changing and dynamic world, to deal with and resolve dilemmas. So even as we take Littlehart's own thinking and method himself, we understand that this is a complex and difficult task, but it's relevant to the Russians because of the way they use history and geography and strategic theory. But it's precisely not only what the Russian state leadership seeks to do, they draw on Littlehart explicitly to do so. And they have done for about 100 years. Okay? So I think this is why I want to use this as a lens. It's not only helpful because we recognize this methodology, we know it, but also the Russians do too. So it's a useful lens into that different world. Second, it's a useful reminder because so often when I've talked about Russia and heard people talking about Russia, we treat Russia as the other, the adversarial other, politically. And I understand why. Moscow makes clear cause with Beijing, it makes clear cause with Tehran, with Pyongyang. So our adversaries in many ways. And then it's explicit about this. The problem from our thinking is that we've then treated Russian strategy as what used to be called by John Keegan and various others, Eastern traditions and ways in war. So we've then imparted to Russia a degree of sophistication and exoticism and mysticism that is entirely unwarranted. It's much better. Okay, we accept that there's an adversarial political environment there, but Russian strategy making is part of the Western tradition of Western family of traditions. This helps us to interpret what's being said because we recognize it. So, for instance, when you hear people talk at length about the sophistication of Russian military theory or the concepts such as Maskirovka, Maskirovka is a French word, masquer, translated into Russian. So we've taken this idea that the Russians do Eastern warfare, they do psychological aspects, and we've turned it into something exotic and almost mystified it, when in fact it's something extremely familiar. Because really what Maskirovka is, I'm sure you've all heard people talk about it, is combat support. Every army does that, or should. The US does it, we do it, well, we used to. Other armed forces also do it. So again, it's that means of learning how we get to interpret this adversary, the Western family of traditions, the European traditions. And this is partly because of that deep and prolonged interaction with European and Euro-Atlantic strategy making. So while of course, those of you who follow Russian will interpret perhaps Frunze's thinking, or Svechin, or Tukhachevsky, or all the great names, Zhukov, and you name it, Agarkov, we can talk about all of them. But you're all familiar with the fact that Clausewitz was a Russian officer, right? So was Jomini. The same traditions. And Clausewitz, Little Heart, Mahan, these are the points of reference when the Russians debate something. Now, they don't always agree with us, of course not. But these are the points of reference, and sometimes they agree because technically speaking it's true, but they can't possibly agree because ideologically it's wrong. But the questions and the central questions and dilemmas remain the same for the Russian leadership as they do for us. And that means the debates are constantly backwards and forwards over the last 150 years. Is it technology or mass? Exquisite technology or mass? Is it steel or spirit? Which has the superior aspect, the offensive or the defensive? How do we deal with the continental or maritime dilemma, which I'm going to keep coming back to? This is important for the Russian leadership. So with this in mind, again, one of the other things is that the Russian leadership, both military and state, is very clear. They're explicit about there are national ways of war and ways in war. So they're very explicit about the German way in war, the US way in war, the British way in war, and their own way in war. So as far as the Russians are concerned, there is definitely a Russian way in war. Why I think this is important is because you're then suddenly looking at two separate things. You're looking at war science, which is the cutting edge of war theory, and that's of who is the best at which time, and that was the French, and then it became the Germans, then it became the United States. Briefly, it was the Soviets, then it was back to the United States. So you're looking for a general principle of where is the theoretical, or where is the cutting edge of what war should look like. But then you come to this idea that war doctrine is a very nation-specific idea and very nation-specific philosophical approach to war. Because of each state's own economic, socio-political, geographic, historical, technological development terms. So here again, you're looking at that sense of Russia's own path and trying to work out what Russia's own path is, but not in isolation from the general discussion of strategy and war. And this is where you find the most prolonged question at the heart of the Russian way in war, which it won't probably surprise you to hear, certainly not if there are French, Germans, Brits, Americans, Italians in the room, the distinction between the strategy of destruction and the strategy of attrition. A very Napoleonic idea, framed by Delbrück, and then taken through obviously Clausewitz and then Delbrück, and framed in that constant set of debates between about how one deals with the experience of the German wars of unification. Big point of Russian reference in thinking about war. World War I, the Civil War, World War II, the debate between the two, of course, of lightning wars, whether that's the Italian version, or whether that's Blitzkrieg, or whether that's Molniyenosnaya Vojna, lightning war in Russia. So this tension between strategy of destruction and strategy of attrition leads us into a series of further tensions, again, when we think about the Russian way in war. That first tension is the distance, that one between the state and its armed forces. And then there is the tension between theory and practice. And in most instances over the last 150 years, these two tensions have not been aligned as far as Moscow is concerned. The result is, in theory and practice, the strategy has resulted in a hedge between the two, which meant that the Russian leadership has enjoyed the advantages of neither and the disadvantages of both. As I'll come to a little bit later, the state and the armed forces are often, imagine this, now this will be a surprise to you, as it is to me. Moscow as a political leadership has given its armed forces some uncomfortably difficult and overly ambitious tasks to achieve. Imagine that. It's never happened in British history, but it happens persistently through Russian history. In fact, there is one example where I can think of where actually Moscow has given its leadership, it's given its armed forces a good position to start with. We can come back to that though. I want to draw a point here for those of you who, like me, are a little bit too nerdy and maybe need to get out more, focus on Russian strategy. And you've heard a bit about this on the military aspect. There's often a line that Russian theory, military theory, is very sophisticated, but the practice is poor. And this is where it comes to that cultural question, strategic culture. And I really want, the most important thing I want for you to do when you leave this room is to question everything you hear about Russian way in war fighting from now on. Because it's absolutely true that the Russian leadership and Soviet leadership and Russian Moscow has had some sophisticated thinkers. No doubt about it. But they've also shot most of them. Those that they haven't shot, they've tended to ignore. Okay, so there is no doubt that there is sophisticated theory. This is often ignored and repressed. If you want to, I mean, we can certainly go through the list of those. I'm not being glib, I'm being practical. The Russians also have some extremely competent combat commanders. I won't say they couldn't write, but they didn't write, certainly not meaningfully. So I encourage you to look deeper into this. It's not a question of good theory, bad practice. In fact, actually, it's quite often the other way around. Russian commanders' practice is often ahead of theory. Again, we can talk a bit about this. I just wanted to float this in front of you and to make sure that we don't land with some let's call it orthodoxy, but really I mean dogma. What we're looking at is a lack of training in some senses, a poor set of theory development for the Russian armed forces, which prepares them poorly for battle organization. And then you have actually some quite competent individuals who've learned what battle organization, operational organization, and war organization means. Again, for those of you who've looked into Russian military theory and how can I put this gently? We have lots of material, we have lots of sources we can dig into and evaluate, but not all the material is the same. It doesn't matter if retired Colonel Ivan Ivanov has written something in Военная мысль. Good, interesting, fine, it's part of a debate, but that's not the same as doctrine, which is not the same as practice. So you have to choose your evidence very carefully. And for the next 5 years, one and all, I'd be very careful when you're reading documents about what the Russians do. The first thing you want to do is look at the footnotes. If they're not quoting the Russians, save your time, go and enjoy the beautiful scenery in Bologna. Because it's not going to tell you anything of any substance, but you're looking at primary sources, then the evaluation of those primary sources. I think this is you're all masters and PhD, I think, as I understand. So this is the way you want. It's not the number of, as Gerasimov himself put it, it's not the number of plump reports that people produce in research institutes or the General Staff Academy. It's the need to convert those into meaningful reality. So as you can see, I'm going from large to detail, from broad scope to specific point. I'll pause that there just to say, way in war goes from strategy to strategy of destruction versus strategy of attrition. There's a hedge, and we have to be a bit careful about that balance between theory and practice. That brings me, however, to this question of the specjalная военная операция, the special war operation. And this is why I think it's important to reflect on this in the Russian way in war, because it reveals, I think, many persistent threat perceptions and many persistent activities and characteristics of this Russian way in war. The threat perceptions, let me give you two examples. The idea that the collective West is going to attack Russia. Well, I've already illustrated that long history since, well, you could take it since the early 19th century. Frankly, that's purely arbitrary. I'd be very happy to accept it going earlier, but it's collective. It's not one state attacking Russia. It's a collective West. The second is that while we might look at this in the UK and think that the idea that Moscow has to denazify Ukraine is absurd and ridiculous, which our senior leadership have called it, and many others have too. I merely remind you that this has been a question in Moscow's thinking since the 1920s. It's been reiterated since, in one format or the other, whether it's the West using Ukrainian nationalism against the Soviet Union, or by the mid-30s, Hitler using Ukrainian nationalism, or in the 40s and the 50s, that sense also being used again. This is a century-long question. Okay, this is a century-long question. Again, I make no case for it. I observe that the threat perception is one that has continued for a long time. That sense of living in different worlds and what is ridiculous and absurd is remarkably persistent also. But when we look at the implementation of this, what we see is the implementation of force to resolve a policy dispute, which is eye-wateringly Clausewitzian. Okay, this is what, when you interpret what Russian war is, it's Clausewitzian. It is the use of armed force to resolve a clash of policies. Now, just so that you don't think that I'm digging this out of nowhere, I want you to think about, please, the campaigns against Poland in 1939, Finland in 1940, Manchuria in 1945, Czechoslovakia in 1968, Afghanistan 1979. I'm going to go on a bit longer, sorry, but there's a reason for this. Chechnya in 1994 and 1998, it is just one war. Georgia in 2008, Ukraine 2014, and Syria 2015. These are all forms of Specjalna Wojenna Operacja, where you do not mobilize the state, you use the armed forces that are standing to resolve a particular policy dispute. So what you saw in 2022, for those, any of you who are interested in history, is in many ways a very thematic and persistent approach by the Russian leadership. You'll note that some of these campaigns have rendered more success for the Russian leadership than others. You'll notice that some of them were over more quickly than others. And we'll go through part of the point to this. But the assault characteristics of speed, surprise, striking in depth, and weight of blow are all very persistent. Incidentally, all of the problems that you have seen in this operation are also remarkably persistent. That gap between the political instruction and military capability to do it. That sense of what I think in the US is called departmentalitis. The inability to conduct the orchestra would be a way of putting that, where certain parts organize their own interests in their own silos. There are a number of ways we can talk about it, but let's call it a failing chain of command that doesn't conduct the orchestra of state. The underestimation of the enemy. And probably the four most obvious military characteristics were also there. Problems in command and control, problems in interoperability, the difficulty of logistics over long distances, and heavy casualties. One and all, whichever conflict you take, whichever use of force Moscow has done, these are characteristics thereof. Incidentally, they're going to remain because they've tussled with these challenges for 150 years and they haven't found a solution for them. They're not going to find one in the next 3 to 5 years. In fact, if you look at the Russian sources, you find considerable recognition of all of these characteristics, both strengths and problems. Especially the armed forces recognize these challenges and have long discussed them. But I want to draw a distinction here, if I may, between what you're seeing within the special operation and just to remind you of the chronology and the context. Because this didn't start, of course, in 2022. In many ways, it didn't even start in 2014. You could quite easily make a case for it starting in 2004, although I'd be happy and interested to debate earlier than that too. But really, since the 2010s, you're looking at much more, not of a strategy of destruction, but the preparation for a strategy of resilience. Really, since 2014, 2015, you have Gerasimov, Gariev, and many others talking about Velika Otechestvenaya Vojna, the Great Fatherland War, so the European theatre in World War II, and a move towards the development of three things: socioeconomic resilience, reshaping the landscape to build popular movements, grassroots fronts in inverted commas, and youth armed force, Junarmia, the youth group, which in the UK I could call Boy Scouts on speed, perhaps. Then you have also the Rosgvardia, the National Guard, but you also have political measures, state level measures of mobilization practice. And in the armed forces, the desire, the intent to grow them, to reorganize, to re-equip, to reverse decisions, to scrap many thousands of armored vehicles, and the establishment of political commissars and the bringing in of the Russian Orthodox Church. You cannot understand Russian military strategy, one and all, if you don't put it in the cultural context. But you absolutely cannot understand it if you don't put it in a state context of strategy making, grand strategy. During the campaigning, we see an acceleration, not a course change. I can talk a bit more about that, but the campaigning, as I say, it really is driving a sense of acceleration to this. So you're finding it much more clear about where the Russian leadership thinks it's going. And that's why I think, as I'll draw to a conclusion now, the Russian way in war is about the state's engagement and level of effort. We've watched that level of effort gently go up through as the knockout blow didn't work, level of effort going up. But war itself is a state strategic phenomenon. For the last 100 years has been talked about as something that happens between Russia and the West. So it is a socio-economic as well as a military phenomenon, and you're looking at state mobilization. The familiarity, therefore, with the complexity and difficulty of strategy and strategic culture writ large is what we're looking at, if you want to begin to interpret this. And therefore, what we're looking at are three things. The shaping by Moscow of a military patriotic fortress, the conversion of Russia from a continental power into a maritime power with a maritime dilemma, to engage in a geo-economic competition that is due to last at least for the rest of this decade, if not into the early next. And on that note, I will draw my remarks to a conclusion and hope that I've not closed questions perhaps so much as opened them. I will say that what Andrew didn't say, I used to work for NATO, so I will take silence as consent, which I would find very disappointing. But the interesting bit to me is the question, so please, I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Should, I hope, generate a lot of questions and comments. For those of you who are, if you're watching live on Zoom, again, please put some comments into the Q&A box there, and I should be able to pick them up and bring them forward for you. So with that, I will open the floor. Start with Michael up front here. Please introduce yourself and then question or comments. Okay.
Michael Lee, I teach here, and after many years working for the European Commission in Brussels and a little bit in the NATO Defence College as well in Rome. Thank you for a fascinating presentation that really situates present developments in a much longer historical context. It opens our eyes to various continuities that we might not be aware of. At the same time, I wonder if this sense of continuity might not blind us in some ways to the specific features of the present situation, for example, and also the cynical manipulation, as it appears to me, by Putin of certain elements in the situation, which I think need to be appreciated in their own right. I mean, if Putin justifies an invasion that he decided on his own ground, partly to rid Ukraine of a sort of Nazi government, and if Lavrov responds to the comment that the Ukrainian president can't be a Nazi because he's Jewish, and turns around and says, well, Jews can be Nazis too. I think we're in a manipulative situation which is other than quite simply the continuity of trends that have been present for decades, if not centuries. I just wonder if the historical context, valid and important though it is to our understanding, might not distract us from some of the specific features of the situation that we're confronted with today.
Super, yes, well, I mean, the answer is yes. But since we almost never talk about the aspects of continuity, I decided to spend 30 minutes speaking to that. I mean, as you may remember from Little Heart, this isn't about continuity as a fixed form of strategic culture prediction. This is about that trend between continuity and an evolutionary change that goes with society, with technology, of course, but also international conditions. Littlehart was writing, like Corbett was, and others were writing at a time of strong international change. So we're always looking at that sense of evolution, not simply strategic culture as deliberate statement of it's all going to be the same forever. So first part to that. Second is that I think we must talk about the specific features of the present. I'd be slightly astonished if anybody in the room who were studying in a course like this hadn't been aware of many of the constant discussions since 22, which is why I chose to spend my time that way. Because very rarely do we hear, as in my interpretation, well, actually, if you see this in the context of 1939, 1940, 1968, and so on, you can see certain elements of persistence. I'm very happy to talk about the specifics aspects of the war itself. Now we've done some context. The second part of this is, again, let me phrase it this way. People are very critical of the way Putin uses history. Putin, for those of you who are going to be surprised, uses history to his own political advantage. Now, is there anyone in this room that is surprised to hear that a politician uses history to their own advantage? No. Okay. So my point is that we should not be surprised to hear politicians using statements, narratives, and so on in fairly cynical manipulation. It is again not to agree with that, and what we can certainly find plenty of statements that validate what you have to say, sir. My point was to observe that the use they are making of this, and they specifically use that idea of Western power to use Ukrainian nationalism, often since the 1930s, in the shape of a battering ram against Russia, is something that has echoed over the last 100 years. Okay, I'm not talking to the particular part now. I think it is a point of interest that this is not something that Putin thought up in 2021. It is not something that he thought of even in 2014. It is something that you can find in the writings of Svechin, of Khrushchev, you name it. For me, that is an interesting point. Everything else, I absolutely agree with you, sir. There is cynical manipulation of a narrative. Very good and very well made point. And I have nothing to add to it, but you should be looking at that sense of where does the history lie? And there are so many aspects of what is happening today and what has happened since 2014 that really you're only be able to interpret in the way of seeing it in a strategic cultural context. Let me give you that final example, is that the Russian manipulation of this, in fact, turns their own history, not only the point of, as you rightly point out, the current example of this with which we may disagree until the end of time. For Moscow, when they argue this, and I'm not saying you should accept it, I'm saying this is the argument. Nazism means the use of the advocation of a hegemonic idea, a hegemonic ideology by one state to try and establish its own horizon. That's how they. I mean,
Very wide.
yes, it's a very wide definition, and as I preempted it, I'm not asking you to agree with it. I'm observing that is the way in, and it's not really actually about Zelensky himself. I accept your points, but add these footnotes just for supportive reference.
I have two questions, if I may.
Of course.
The first one is, where does the Western perception and or fear of nuclear threat or within Russian waging war? And second, Russia presence in Africa is increasing, either formally or informally. And so would you think about the growing instability on the African continent as a reason to start special operation on the ground? Thank you.
Do you mean special operation in Africa?
In Africa, yeah.
Okay, so let me take that second one first, if I may. What we're looking at with regards to the situation in Africa is a broader context of what Moscow has interpreted explicitly since about the mid-2000s, but we can trace it a little bit earlier than that. The emergence of effectively a geo-economic competition through a global geo-economic contest. So really what you're looking at that underpins, and they're very explicit about this, and they've said it morning, noon and night, more or less for the last 20 years, is that what you're looking at is an international contest for access to resources, access to transit routes, and access to trading, to markets. Okay, and an awful lot of what you're seeing now, if you want to really interpret what the military tool is for, it's for protection and access to those questions. So you will certainly see other aspects of this. It's not that nobody in this room surely will go monocausal and say, well, there's an example here that I found that does. Almost invariably, whether it's raw material or access to a market or access to a transit route, is where you will see the Russian military being positioned. Sometimes that also works in other ways. For instance, support for a state. So you might see, for instance, a state that worries about its own internal stability will bring in Russian peacekeepers, or you know, choose your euphemism of sort, and the payment for that will be access to minerals or resources. Sometimes you'll find that Russian nuclear power plants will turn up. They will bring their own commodity to it, and then you'll find that those other capabilities will come together. Could I envisage there being a special operation there? It's hard to see at the moment, but maybe ask me again in a year's time. You're looking at a slightly different kind of thing. I mean, you could say, for instance, Syria was indeed and they refer to it in that way as a special operation. So is it possible to envisage that? In theory, yes. But at the moment, in practice, I think it's probably a bit far away. But your question about that, your context about that is exactly spot on. And actually, if you want to be really clever at this, you want to be looking not only at what's happening in Africa, which of course, as you know, is both sub-Saharan as well as Northern Africa, but it's also in other continents too. And you're looking at Latin America. You're looking at, of course, across the Indian Ocean into Southeast Asia. And if you want to be really clever, you're looking at Anbar. Okay, because what you're doing is you're seeing the bigger context of a struggle for resources. And you're seeing already Moscow positioning itself for access incidentally with Beijing, for access to rediscussion of the Antarctic Treaty. Now, that doesn't feature on people's radar at the moment, because really we look at the moment of the panic of the day, and the Russians have turned up in Mali, or they're here, or they're there. Actually, there is a coherent organization to much of this, and you can see Russian trade routes and trade corridors evolving alike. Now, your excellent question about the Russian nuclear capability. As you heard when I took the remarks through, you heard me make that distinction between Specjalная военная операция, special war operation, and war. And that distinction is really about the level of state mobilization. Okay, and you heard me reference the Great Fatherland War, Великая Отечественная война, and World War III. I didn't go into it because it's possibly a little too nerdy, but actually, since I hear there are friends in the audience, I'm very happy to do that. There are levels of state effort. And when you get to regional war level, региональная война, or large-scale war, which is крупномасштабная война, which is global, that's when you start to see the bringing in of full mobilization. And when you see this question of full mobilization, material and spiritual, of the resource of the state, that's when the question of nuclear capability comes into the matter. So for all of the operation you see at the moment, if you envisage it, it's like a framing device to keep the Americans and others out while they resolve something specifically. But if there was to be a direct war between any form of NATO and Russia, that's already a regional war, at least, if not, given Iranian, North Korean, and Chinese support for Russia, a global war, which indeed brings that strategic question into play. So deterrence primarily, until it becomes war fighting. I will just offer two final points on that, since I suspect there may be some nuclear interest in the room. Like the US and the British since the mid-1970s, first the Soviet leadership and then now the Russian leadership are extremely uncertain about controlling a limited nuclear war. Okay, and there's a lot of doubt in this. And two things emerge from this. First of all, it's very unlikely that you might be able to, it's very unlikely that you can control that escalation, because being good Clausewitzians, war has an escalatory force all of its own. Okay, so in the rough Russian escalation ladder, you could probably pitch 17 or 18 rungs in this, depends on, take your pick, but 17 or 18 rungs. The nuclear question comes in at around 13 or 14. The end of the known universe is 18. Okay, so that escalation goes like this. So nuclear weapons are not a war-winning tool, right? So there's a considerable amount of doubt about this. And again, you can, I think we have some clarity about what it is without a great deal of precision because of the emotional and strategic decision-making and so on and the like, and emotions within war and so on. But we have a framework for interpreting that. And that is the use of strategic capabilities as a deterrent. When it comes to use, there is a messaging service, so to speak, which is metaphorically, I say, is sort of drawing the jacket back to show the weapon, which will be rung 14, unhitching the weapon and jiggling it in the holster to demonstrate, do you really want to do this? Rung 15, and then you're shooting, and you're so you don't win a war with nuclear weapons. And actually, I think they're quite, so there's a lot of effort that's gone into how do you win a war under the nuclear bracket. And that's why you often end up with specjalne wojenne operacje. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
If only because the past 2 weeks in our class, we've been talking about escalation ladders and Con. So,
Very good.
all right.
So there's
and watch Dr. Strangelove.
Okay, well, very good.
But
But there's Kalportion, there's Boluyevsky,
Right.
there's all sorts of different sources for this, but
Right.
that's roughly where I think we can get to.
Great. All right. Here, here, and then here. Okay, just, and if anybody else, just sort of raise your hand. I'll keep you on 1, 2, and then 3. Please.
Thanks. I'm Dr. Brent Dawson. I'm an associate fellow here from temporarily for 3 months from the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. I just have a question about the Russian strategic objective for the war in Ukraine. Some argue that what the Russian leadership is trying to do is to find a way to rebuild Russian power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And others argue that it's more of a defensive measure to demonstrate a red line, no European security and political institutions in Ukraine. Ukraine must remain neutral. It's an unacceptable, almost existential threat to us if Ukraine isn't neutral. And I'm just wondering which of those arguments do you think is correct, or perhaps both are part of the strategic Russian rationale? Thank you.
Thank you. Another very good question. So because you're familiar, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those parts of the debate, and in the spirit of the afternoon, I'm going to disagree with both of them and offer a third. It's not really that I disagree with them, but I want to try and turn that, if I may, while still answering your question. I think that what you see is a Russian leadership that has deliberately and explicitly sought to achieve control of specific geoeconomic assets. And that means control, actually turning the Sea of Azov into a Russian internal lake, the acquisition of port facilities, to the extent they will need to be rebuilt, the acquisition of territory, which has quite substantial minerals and resources. But also it's about knocking out an adversary, because you may recall that in 2020, before COVID and then before the renewed assault in 2022, there were 2 states in the region that were in the top 5 of grain exporters. One was Russia, the other was Ukraine. Not anymore. Okay, there's a lot of geoeconomic aspect to this where people talk a good game about certain, and you may remember in 2022 and 2023, there was a strong argument, well, why are Russians trying to seize eastern Ukraine? There are no resources there left anyway. Miraculously, 2 years later, well, actually, it turns out there are quite a lot of resources left. So what you really want to be doing, and again, please bear in mind my earlier comments, none of this is monocausal. But underpinning this is a very explicit set of stated and acted upon views, not narratives. I still accept the underpinning of your question about the narratives, but a very specific series of explicit views and efforts to make the most of geoeconomic positioning. And as you look at the Russian economy, a large chunk of it comes out via the Black Sea, which accesses the Gulf, or let's just call it the Middle East and North Africa and the Gulf. So this is prime territory for Moscow as far as that geoeconomic contest is concerned. Let me riff a little bit off the first part, if I may, of your question, because it's something else that I'm working on, and it ties back to that sense of strategy. You may recall a related part to these debates that you refer to is Moscow strategic or tactical in its outlook? Does it operate on an ad hoc, opportunistic way, or is it strategic in outlook? In fact, a lot of Russian power was rebuilt before it renewed its assault on Ukraine in 2022, because Moscow is pursuing a strategy. Because it did things in 2022, and in fact, it's done things since 2022 that it simply couldn't do 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. So I think, you know, and I mean, I'll try this out. I'm not quite happy with the answer to this, but as a means of making sure we're talking in the right direction. I think you see Russian decline through the 1980s, and then you see continued and accelerated decline through the dissolution of the Soviet Union. You can choose your, bless you, choose your word to this, but the dissolution, I think, is the one we want to look at into the 1990s, but then I think if I use the right term, you see retrenchment in the 2000s. Maybe even the brake being put on in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then a degree of retrenchment from there, an organized effort at strategy making through the 2000s into the 2010s, which builds state power. Okay, so you're not really looking at 2022 as being a way to rebuild Russian power. You're seeing 2022 as the result of the effort to rebuild Russian. And in fact, what you're going to see as we emerge from this towards the next half of this is how that state power is altering again in its dynamism. And I didn't talk a bit about this too much. I didn't talk about this at all. But for all of you, when you're thinking about Russia, there's one date you should have in mind. That's 2030. I think you obviously have to be aware, as I've indicated throughout my remarks, that you look about history and inheritance and the evolution of problems over time. But this is a forward-looking state. Many of the rhetorical aspects and the symbolic aspects of the past, sure, I'd accept that, obviously. But you're actually looking at a new world and how Moscow seeks to contribute to this new world and be active in this world and influence and impact on this new world. And that is a world of 2030 and 2035. So I think, I accept the premise of your two questions. I think they're absolutely right, and I hope you don't mind me riffing off it in slightly different ways.
It's great. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to note, there's two questions from online too. So just for those watching, I do see those. So I'm going to start interleaving it. So I'll do one more in the room and I'll do a couple online and then I'll get to others in the room here. So, okay, over here, I think.
That was also a question. I think.
Yeah.
Hey, Jared, I'm master student. You might have partly answered this already, but you mentioned the shift from continental to a maritime focus. I just want to ask, why has there been a shift in focus, and how does this change the character of future threats, both as Russia perceives them and also how the threats could manifest?
I'll tell you what, can I just jump on that and add, we have a question from online, which builds on that. So I'll do two and then we'll do a continental maritime answer. Thank you for taking time to speak to us on the topic of Russia. You talked about continental versus maritime. I know historically Russia has struggled to effectively allocate resources between the Army and the Navy, not knowing which to prioritize and which serves its best interests. Does this tension persist today? And if so, would you say that the competing priorities have contributed to the Russian army struggles in Ukraine? So we've got the two questions on that maritime continental piece.
Yeah, okay, let me start with the second one and bring it down to your question here. Yes, absolutely, Russia, that you can follow this through that sense of fashion and taboo really over the last, again, taking that hundred and something years, that long century, let's call it, where you've had periods where the Russian Navy has been a point of priority. The obvious one, I suppose you would say, under Brezhnev and Gorshkov, but Stalin was a flottophile. Stalin was quite supportive of the Navy in many ways. And I've not gone chronologically on this, you understand, but equally there have been times when the Navy is essentially, I won't go as far as say taboo, but where the Navy has really struggled. Partly from Kronstadt, from the earliest days of the Soviet Union, where the Navy was involved in the counter-revolutionary Kronstadt rebellion. But then subsequently, when senior leaders were purged, I don't really like that term, repressed better in the 20s and 30s. So you're absolutely right. There is a question of let's call it fashion and taboo, but there is also a question of, as you rightly say, competing priorities. And it's exactly the right question, because when you line up what Little Hart was doing with his way in war, like Corbett was doing with his way in war, it was trying to move the debate beyond the disputes between services for resources. Now, happily in the United Kingdom, there is no dispute between our army, our air force, and our navy for resources. And I'm quite sure that's the case in the United States. Is that right?
Yes.
Good. So nevertheless, in Russia, there is indeed, and there has long been, a debate between the army and the navy. But what you're seeing is, under Putin, continued, persistent and consistent allocation of resources to the navy since the 2010s. And you've seen in the last year or so that the navy itself is undergoing another reorganization. Last year in May, for instance, Nikolai Patrushev was moved from the Security Council, Secretary of Security Council position, to being presidential aide to oversee maritime affairs and shipbuilding. Many people see this as a demotion. I caution against that. I think this is an appointment to oversee a specific task, because the Navy is receiving a lot more funding now, and it's directly under presidential control. So I think that you'll see. I'm going to make I'll make a little prediction here. I know we're being recorded and put online, but I'm going to chance my arm. This year, you're going to see a new strategy for the development of the Navy published. You'll also see a law on shipbuilding published. And that means that there's incidentally a major audit of the United Shipbuilding Corporation underway. I think you're going to see a lot of effort put into this. So the army may have a set of questions, and they have the state authorities to worry about in this case, because Putin, Patrushev and others are now overseeing an investment in the Navy that they want to work. So that, I think, will affect, I don't want to call too early on there being a new state armaments program, although there will be, obviously, and a new doctrine produced in the wake of campaigning. But I think this is going to affect that, and I think that the Navy has more of a chance of landing more resources in this than the Army does, even though the Army is going to be very strong competition. Which leads me to your question, so which is, what causes the shift from the continental to maritime focus? It's two things. It's the nature of Russia's economy and the nature of the primary threat. So during the 1930s and 40s, the main threat really was German, which was a continental assault. But really, since then, in many ways, the primary concern has been from maritime powers. This is that continental maritime dilemma. The UK has a maritime continental dilemma, but Russia has a continental maritime one, because where do you put the resources? We have the longest, speaking as in inverted commas as a Russian, we have continental power, but we have the longest coastline in the world. We have problems accessing those oceans. We have 4.5 fleets, because we have to distribute our naval capacity between the Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, and the Baltic Sea Fleet with the Caspian Flotilla. So there's a lot of problems that go into this, and it depends on the nature of the threat. One of the reasons the Army is so successful in this is because it keeps talking about, well, we've got continental power. we win our continental wars, which broadly speaking they do. They might be a mess, but they often win them. Whereas the wars that the Russian leadership has often lost have been against maritime powers. So think the Crimean War, think the Russo-Japanese War, think its two main competitors through the 19th and 20th century being the US and the UK. The second part is why now and why does this matter? It's because much of the Russian economy depends on trade by sea. In fact, I probably won't go so far as say it all depends on the sea, but that'd be too much. But a large chunk of it depends on trade by sea, import and export. So it's timely, it's important, it's only growing. And if you look, I'll just add to that because I want to place this in the broader context as we saw Russia, but not in isolation from what's happening in the world. Everyone's investing in their navies. So and more trade is going by sea. So it's not that Russia is somehow being an outlier. Russia is actually part of a wider trend. Whether you're an Australian, whether you're Chinese, whether you're British, whether you're our navies pose something interesting to this. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Is it under pressure? Is it not? But generally there is a sense of investment in maritime power, however that is widely defined, and Russia is part of that because of economic and military threats, or economic opportunity, and military threats.
I'll be fascinated as to how the Russian Navy figures out the future balance of large platforms, small platforms, crewed, uncrewed, because because if they come out with something in the next year, I'll be fascinated to see how they make some of those choices, because that is something, of course, the US Navy is struggling with mightily and trying to figure out these sort of things.
Well, as you say, Andrew, sorry to riff off that because I know there are questions more important, but again, it's another example of how Russian state strategy and thinking about war directly echoes the same sets of questions we have. Large platform, small platform, firing platform, maritime support and reconnaissance. So again, that sense of, is it mass or is it exquisite technology? Is it spirit or is it steel? Either on land or at sea or in the air. So we can use this to interpret Russian thinking without having to reinvent the wheel.
We'll see if we get the maritime reconnaissance strike complex.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Okay. So, all right, question here in the room, and then I do see the second one online. I just want to let the person know that you see them there. Okay.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Arjun Joshi. I'm a first-year master's student here. You mentioned this briefly when you were talking about Russia distinguishing or not distinguishing between the European elements of the Napoleonic and German invasion in World War II. But in Professor Redchenko's Russian foreign policy class, we've been reading some thinkers like Dugin and other contemporary Russians who there seems to be an undercurrent of grievance or of resentment over where Russia's place in the world is. And I was curious whether you think that's a fair assessment of how Russian leaders or thinkers do conceptualize Russia at this moment in time, and more to the point, if you feel that this is trickled into operations by the military or how the Russian military conducts itself. I think of the theft of Ukrainian grain, for example, or the shocking or the more aggressive brutality in Ukraine against civilian targets. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arjun. Lots of material there. I think I would probably, since you've already mentioned Dugin, your background reading to this, I'm going to do the same to your question as I did to this gentleman's question, and turn it and come from a different angle, if you don't mind. I think you're definitely looking at how Moscow sees its place in the world, and that's why I argue you all ought to be looking at 2030 or 2035. I don't see it as grievance. I see it as I mean, we can make it, look, I'm a Brit speaking about this, I can use the word grievance should I wish. I think if I was Russian standing in front, I wouldn't call it grievance, I would call it the nature of how we position ourselves in the future world. The world is changing. This is what you're seeing at the moment, again, to choose the Russian debate. And I must say, I don't personally look too hard at Dugin. You're looking at foresight, which is indeed geostrategic. I absolutely take and accept. But I think you're looking at this being interpreted as something like a 21st century version of the 30 Years' War. So a structural change in international affairs, which this which this campaigning is driving and continuing. Again, I don't see it as grievance. I see it as something of a pessimistic outlook. It's true. If you look, for instance, at the if you look at almost all Russian scenarios, they're pretty pessimistic because they publish these both by experts and by the leadership. They're all pretty pessimistic. They all anticipate not just competition but conflict, even war. So you're looking at a state that is trying to maintain its sovereignty on the basis that it's arguing that by the end of this decade or by the time this 21st century version of the 30 Years' War is over, only a small handful of states will still be sovereign actors. And that's probably, as far as Russian scenarios go, Russia, obviously, India, China, the US, and maybe one or two others that might surprise us. You might look at United Arab Emirates, for instance. You might look at Brazil, for instance. So that's probably how I would seek to answer this. You're always looking really at strategic foresight, which is based on geostrategy. That's why I think Dugin is helpful, but I would urge, not sure I would probably, well, because you've already read it, I'm sure you've read it very carefully because it's been on your reading list, and I'm sure that's why it's done. I would recommend that you look at those like Mahmoud Gariev, for instance, where you see, since you mentioned the military part, this is actually something that the Russian leadership switched to almost, in military particularly, switched to almost immediately after the end of the Cold War. So you see it's a futures-driven question. Does that?
It's ambition, not grievance
I
or
think
revisionism.
Exactly, it's ambition, not grievance. It's a way of looking at the world. So apart from we might say, well, globalization is our approach to the world, whereas for Russia it's geostrategic, and it's a good way of demonstrating how again we speak different languages and we're again drawing different historical lessons, but we use different terminology, globalization or geostrategy, and the Russian leadership, we might say democracy in Ukraine, whereas and Georgia, whereas the Russians will say these are ethno-nationalist confrontations. So all these ways, it's difference. And once you start to fill it through these, then you begin to be able to interpret where Moscow is trying to position itself.
So I've got two other questions online. Let me take the first and then we'll come back to the room and then we'll go back to online. So from Carlos, what is your opinion of the fact that Russian strategic culture is mainly based on a vertical of power? The leader czar executes his will, leveraging state power to liquidate domestic and foreign adversaries to his worldview and agenda. Is this pattern of history a truth you accept? And if so, how can the forces of history alter such a self-destructive strategic culture?
Okay. So what I've done so far is I've resisted telling you about the books that I've written. However,
Which is highly unusual.
However, so I'm now going to withdraw from this restraint. It's a very good question. It's an important one, and it's not one that's answered very immediately. But let's just be explicit. Vertical власть does exist. Yes, the idea of creating a vertical chain of command certainly exists in Russia. Vertical власть is the vertical of authority, let's call it. Which we would call a chain of command. It's very easy here, however, to overlook what I was talking about earlier as the culture part of this and the strategy part of this. In that strategy, and the Russians find it difficult, if not more difficult than many others, to get the orchestra playing from the same sheet of music. So I accept the first part of the question, but I think I would find a different answer to the second, which is actually the vertical of power is that sense of trying to organize the state functionality. And the reason I point to the book is because there's lots and lots of evidence for the fact that vertical power doesn't work. Whereas Putin says things, he also has to be his own desk officer. He also has to go out and do his own and oversee. That's why the appointment of people like Patrushev as federal locomotives and icebreakers, if you call them so, are sent out to establish this presidential authority and extend it. Yes, of course, we can talk about authoritarianism and corruption and the difficulties, but actually within the vertical of power, if you look at strategy, You're looking at the difficulty of organizing ministries that have different points of reference, that defend their own bureaucracies, that defend their own resources, that empire build themselves. So that departmentalitis, the Russians suffer from this very greatly. But that question of culture as well. And there's a great example where Putin, for instance, I think this was the leak in the High North. There was a leak 4 years ago, I think. Should know, sorry, I've been speaking too long. There was a leak a short while ago in the High North where Putin finds out about it from the media. And you can see him admonishing the team in public afterwards because the chain of command hasn't worked. So how can this be measured? Well, that again, that comes to the book. It's called Power in Modern Russia. For those of you who have enemies you wish to punish, or maybe gifts to loved ones, the state makes a considerable effort to try to resolve these by different forms of response. Partly to organise supra-institutional bodies, such as the Government Coordination Council. Partly to appoint specific individuals, so someone close to the president with the president's authority will be tasked to oversee this, and partly by organising what we would call gongos, so what the state leadership calls grassroots movements, all to monitor the implementation of instructions. So it's not quite as simple as a vertical of power, but if you use the strategic culture approach, and definitely using strategy and definitely using culture, you can interpret vertical velocity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Simon. I'm a first year student here. My question is regarding the Arctic. So you sort of talked in a way already about why that area is important. This change to maritime power, shipping, oil and gas up there also. It seems like Russia for many years has sort of been content that the Arctic has remained a low tension area and has sort of enjoyed Arctic exceptionalism. How do you see now, both after the previous Trump administration sort of said we will do global power competition with China and Russia everywhere, also in the Arctic? There's like Pompeo's famous speech in 2019, if you recall. How do you see now with Trump back in the White House, this whole talk about Greenland, which we can probably agree is more of an expression of an interest in the Arctic? How do you see Russia tackling this issue? And also, weirdly, now that Trump seems to be very positive towards Russia and seems to sort of use China as the big enemy all the time, how will that take place in the Arctic, where Russia, of course, is the big competitor? Thank you.
Well, again, excellent question. And you, like all of them, you're asking about 5 or 6 questions within one, and I shall do my best to try to answer. As far as the Arctic is concerned, I think you see the Russian leadership speak explicitly about this as its strategic reserve for the 21st century for global competition. So considerable investment, considerable organization, considerable state effort goes into trying to establish Russia in an environment which is extremely inhospitable for either for resource exploitation or even for shipping. So, but it is proprietorial about it. So the Northern Sea Route, as you probably know, is referred to by Moscow as a Russian internal waterway. I think this gives you already an indication of Moscow's interest. So when you hear anybody else talk about their interest in the High North, the Arctic, the Northern Sea Route, freedom of navigation, geoeconomic competition, resources, commodities, any of these questions writ large, what you see is I think Moscow's resistance to their intervention in that in any way that might be above, let's call it 25% or 24% ownership in inverted commas. I don't mean ownership, I mean people can play a role, can contribute to its development, that kind of thing. But as far as Moscow is concerned, it should remain Russian, because it's going to be the engine for growth. I mean, you'll know that while many have been watching the prosecution of the Spitsnaya voenная operacja on the one hand in against and in Ukraine, Moscow has also shaped, developed, resourced, and is now trying to implement the strategy for the development of the Northern Sea Route to 2035. That's a major strategic undertaking in its own right. Okay, so for me, this is an indication of why we should see the Specjalna Wojenna Operacja as a military form of operation within a broader strategic context. And bearing in mind that the role of history that I mentioned, the use of history, while we are talking 2030 and 2035 with the Northern Sea Route, you are seeing hydrocarbon resource fields discoveries there being called Zhukov and Rokossovsky. For those of you who don't know, these were two Soviet marshals that won them the Eastern Front in the Second War. So strategic reserve draws on history, symbolism, demonstratively clear about the role that is to play. I think when I hear the US talk about Greenland, and let's be clear, also Panama, among other examples, I think in Moscow, to interpret their view, you would say, well, at least now we're honestly speaking on the same frequency. This is a geoeconomic competition for the resources of the world. So I think that Moscow again will consider itself to be its foresight to be being proven correct. My other view is that I think that although Moscow and Washington appear to be speaking on the same frequency now, they will probably continue to disagree just on the same frequency. I honestly can't tell you whether that means they disagree more loudly in future or whether they agree to coexist on the basis of disagreement. I couldn't tell you that. If I knew the answer, I'd be much more important and much better paid. But what you're looking at really, please don't forget when you see these sets of discussions, what you're looking at is a 20-year set of disagreements between the Euro-Atlantic community on the one hand and Russia on the other. Okay, we're looking at 20 years worth of disagreement, of dissonance, of policy disputes across the board that different governments, whether it be the US government, whether it be NATO leaderships, whether it NATO ally leaderships, have tried to reset this relationship, but have found that very difficult. And instead of resets, what you found is increasing from dissonance to competition to contest. So in some senses, what you're looking at, in my view, is probably the best result as far as Moscow and Washington are concerned is an agreement to coexist, which will have to be hammered out, as we've heard, I think, today in the news and yesterday in the news. Well, it's only the very beginning of the beginning. Let's not get over precise about where those results are. The final point I'll make is something I've written a bit about, which I think is important, that we tend to see Moscow as an East-West state, a European state. And within that, your perfectly correct comment about the importance of the Arctic to Russia. I think it's more helpful for us to see Russia as a North-South power than an East-West power. And therefore, what you're looking at is both the Arctic and Antarctica, but you're looking at that line, that sweep from the resource base of the high north, the Arctic, as being aspects of this. It's not simply an east-west shipping lane. It's a concept for the development. The Northern Sea Route is a concept for the delivery of resource to growing markets, which are in the MENA region, which are in the Indo-Pacific, or what Moscow calls the Asia-Pacific region. So you're looking at a north-south power. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important for Russia.
So I've got one in the back of the room and one online. So we're getting close to near the end of the time. So I'll ask you to do, let me do a short one online, and I'm going to ask you to do a short answer to it. So this is for those teaching graduate level international security. What key books or readings in English do you recommend for covering Soviet Russia dimensions, past and present? So give us your top three. And if they're all yours, that's okay. But
Monaghan, Andrew,
right.
Paramount, Russia.
Yeah.
So what key books?
So in English, recommend for covering Soviet/Russia dimensions, past and present. And then we've got one more question here.
Okay.
Make sure we cover both. So let's do a short one here, and then we'll get to the question.
How about because there are probably some ideas that will come. How about we answer that question that's coming, and I'll percolate the other one.
All right. So in the back, please.
Yeah, sorry.
My question, my name is Ada, and I study international relations. I specialize in foreign justice and security, but I'm attending the Russian foreign policy course here. And my question was, in my head, and thinking about this, contest kind of, between agency and between the culture. And, so right this week, we've spoken about Yeltsin and the NATO enlargement and how sometimes what he did and what he said didn't align with what military would advise possibly. And I'm thinking, just, do you think that Putin's past and the fact that he was a KGB officer, obviously has an impact with the alignment of, military goals? And if we see a switch of leadership at one point, would that change something in the military strategy, or would this culture still be so strong that it would persist, if I make sense? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly making sense. An excellent set of questions. You're absolutely right and I emphasised throughout my remarks the tension between the state leadership and the armed forces. So we don't have to. You're right to choose Yeltsin. Let me point out that all of the distinctions that we might have between the Russian political elite within the 1990s and the military about spending, for instance, about Chechnya. Where are we? We are Thursday. You and I could sit in the room until Sunday evening with all the distinctions between Yeltsin and the Russian armed forces through the 1990s. But we could take this back into the Soviet Union as well in the 70s and 80s, where Agarkov disagrees with the political leadership about Afghanistan. So your point is very well made to illustrate something that is a persistent feature of Russian state or Moscow's state power and the often disharmony between state power and the armed forces. That's something that is just to use three examples: Brezhnevite, Yeltsinite, and Putinite. Okay, I'm not going to in this format predict who or suggest who might come after, but that's going to remain the case. Okay, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, in my view, who is the president here. You will have internal discrepancies, I think, not all the time, but not over everything, because, as you know, the military doesn't tend to play a very political role within Russia, so we have to be quite cautious there. Second part, Putin is a KGB officer. I mean, as you probably know, some of your Soviet past, if you're doing the course on it, the KGB and the armed forces weren't necessarily friends. So. Who is the defense minister in Russia at the moment? Belousov. Who was the last one? Shoigu. One before that? Serdyukov. One before that? Sergei Borisovich Ivanov. None of them are officers in the armed forces. The last one was Igor Sergeyev. So again, that gives you an indication. And in fact, we might even return, if I can answer, I'll offer this, when you look at this, and one of Johnston's disagreements with strategic culture was that there's more than one culture in a state. Right. And you're looking at a variety of cultures, one of which is state power, one of which is security service power, one of which is armed forces power. Not all of them are harmonious. I think it's very important to keep these various different aspects moving: individual agency, cultural restraints, geographic, let's call it wide geographic, broad scope geographic, not just geography, but socioeconomic geography. All of these are moving dynamically at certain stages. And I'll give you one example why agency matters, but matters a lot, but not necessarily fully. In the 2010s, when there was campaigning for one of the presidencies, and there were 5 candidates on the polling list, and the question was, who of the 5 candidates can actually get things done in Russia? No prizes for guessing that it was Vladimir Vladimirovich. You know that he got 14%, right? 14% thought that he was the one who could get things done. Nobody else made it to double figures. The person, or the vote for nobody can, won by hands down with 37%. Right, so agency is really important, but the cultural aspect is also important, and so is geography. I hope that answers the questions. You've got to keep, unfortunately, because the pleasure and why this is so interesting is because it's so difficult to work out where it is. If you don't know who's who and why and what the tasking is, you don't know why Belousov was appointed defense minister, for instance, you can't interpret what's going on in Russia. But if you don't put Belousov into the context of having to work in this vast, sprawling defense landscape that has security services, military industrial complex, armed forces, navy, as you rightly say, army, air forces. So there's the context of that. And then there's, of course, the context of the inheritance of Soviet power.
Any books
As for
come to
books,
mind?
so
Yeah,
what I will
last
say,
one.
what I'm going to say for, because what key books and Soviet Russia dimensions, past and present, you've offered me such a broad range. I'm going to offer, because I'm talking about way in war, I'm going to talk about probably, let's say, 3 authors that I think you want to dig up. And I'm going to say, because we're in Johns Hopkins, my guess is that you'll have plenty of access to American strategic thinkers, which is very good. So I think you should look up John Erickson. I think you should look up Peter Vigor, Vigor. And I think you should look up, okay, I'm going to take, this is where I think you should really go if you want to learn about the Russian aspect. You can find a couple of the books, they're a bit harder to find, but I think that you should then look to the translations that our American allies did often, and occasionally some Brits did, of the Russian thinkers in the late Cold War era. So you should be looking at original Russian sources translated into English. I would suggest you look at Svechin, and I would suggest that you look at Mahmoud Gariev. So 2 Brits and 2 Russians. Obviously I can go on a little bit longer. The other thing I would say is, for those of you who are studying anything to do with Russia here, whether it's tangentially because you're on a different course, or whether it's Russia specifically, the closer you can get to your Russian sources, the better. The closer, the sooner, and the more you can roll around in those sources and learn to interpret them, the more you're going to be able to function in this and interpret what they mean, the references to whom, about whom are they speaking, what are the implicit references, what are the explicit references, what are the historical references. And there's a lot of material online. And then you can use Google Translate. It's not perfect. You know, I don't particularly think it's brilliant as someone who finds language interesting. But however you get close to this, and also if you're going to read these sources, my final note would be, please read the sources, not what somebody tells you about them. Okay, Putin's speeches, Lavrov's speeches, take your pick. But like with Trump's speeches or Keir Starmer's speech, please read the speech, because then you'll work out what you think about it yourself. And I think that will immediately take you to a better terrain. And it's not about agreeing with it or disagreeing with it. It's about being better informed about what's been said. And on that note, maybe I'll just finish by saying 3 things. Or 2 things. One, this is a Russia session. Some of you are doing Russia studies. What you will hear a lot about is discussion about Russia over the next 2 to 3 months, and then subsequently. When someone's talking to you about Russia, I think there are 3 sets of questions you should always ask, particularly since you're in beautiful sunny Bologna. First is, really? First question is, really? Is that what happened? Is that really what so-and-so said? Really? Keep pressing, because actually you'll find people are just firing off shots, in my view. So really is the first question. Keep pressing for that, for the evidence. The second is which Russians? Because there is always a chain of command. There's always a tasking. There's always a reason for someone's appointment. So which Russians? And if the answer comes back, well, it's Putin, or it's the Kremlin, or it's Russia, it's a beautiful sunny city to go and have a look at. You'll be much better off. The third is, well, what's that concept in Russian? What's the language? What's the Russian language and conceptual thinking for that? And we've often heard about hybrid warfare or A2AD and these aspects, deterrence, particular forms of deterrence. Okay, what are the Russian versions of this? Because some concepts, you know, you're all linguists one way or the other. Language is there to reflect a concept and how it's thought through. If there is no Russian term for it, it means there isn't a Russian concept for it. And this is where we've got, I think, frozen up a little bit on the exoticization and mythologization of mythicization, whatever the word would be. I can't even use my own language, let alone somebody else's. We've become very focused on using what we think are terms that describe Russian reality, which simply have no bearing on Russian reality at all. So what is the evidence, which Russians and what language, what the concepts are, I think will save you a lot of time. Always look at the footnotes when you read something about Russia. And thank you for turning up. I'm honored that you turn up when you have such a beautiful afternoon in spring. Thank you for your questions, which I've really enjoyed, and thank you, Andrew, for the hospitality and looking after me.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We're excited by these things. Come back in mid-April. On April 14th, we'll have Dr. Katarzyna Zisk from, she's currently up in Norway, but she'll be coming talking about Russia and nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy.
I'm going to do it just at the end here, just because I'm in an academic audience and I feel I ought to. I do actually, for those of you who have trouble sleeping, I do have a book coming out on this called Blitzkrieg and the Russian Art of War. It's out in July. As I say, a lot of the themes in this are in there. Lots of the questions on Russian strategy, Russian interaction. Please feel free to be in touch. Happy to engage, but thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Really. The last one.